To help us dig deeper into some of the airline industry trends, I spoke with the travel detective himself. His name is Peter Greenberg, and he's a travel news journalist. I started by asking him why consumers say they can't get good service for a good price anymore.
Well, you called it. It's about numbers. About 6 years ago, we had 8 major airlines in this country. Now we're down to 4. So we have the fewest choices in my recent memory. And the airlines are no longer competing for market share. They're no longer feeling the need to be competitive because they control their own markets. They're only competing for yield, how to get the most amount of money for any available seat. And as you may know, the airlines are operating at about 86% load factor, which is essentially full. I challenge anybody to tell me that they've been on a flight recently that wasn't completely full. So that's where the law of supply and demand kicks in. Airfares have nowhere to go but higher.
And there's been this talk of allowing foreign airliners to compete for the same routes inside the United States. Obviously, the domestic carriers are pushing back against that idea. With all of the lobbying power that they have, what do you think the chances are of that happening?
Well, foreign carriers have been trying to do cabotage for a long time, and it has never, all pun intended, flown, and it probably won't fly now. The airlines can't even get their act together in terms of their strategic alliances, let alone figuring out inventory to allow a foreign carrier, for example, like British Airways to fly between Los Angeles and New York, or Qantas to be able to fly from Chicago to Cleveland. An unlikely pairing, but you get the concept. So I wouldn't hold my breath for that.
But if you think about the consequences to the consumer, it really would be something that consumers would like.
What consumers want and what the airlines are willing to give them are two different things right now. The airlines are making money for the first time since the Wright brothers. They're doing very well for their shareholders and their executives because they've decided to limit their capacity. And by practicing what they would call capacity discipline, they don't have to fly to every city. In fact, if you surveyed 100 major airports in this country, you know what you'd find? 77% of them would tell you they have drastically fewer flights than they had 3 or 4 years ago. And if you take a look at cities like Cincinnati, Cleveland, Memphis, Ontario, California, St. Louis, I could go on, those cities are in big trouble in terms of actual airlift. They're not getting service.
Well, I think that you're leading me to the question about earnings then, because obviously we're getting Delta earnings today, and we'll be next week getting a number of other airlines' earnings reports, and they look pretty robust, at least for Delta, and the prediction is that the rest of the airlines are going to report pretty nice earnings as well. But you're basically saying that's at a cost to the consumer.
Well, it's at a cost to the consumer, and it will continue to be at a cost to the consumer, for the simple reason that the airlines are not just making money from airfares, they're making money from ancillary fees. We're talking billions and billions of dollars, and those fees are not taxed at federal excise tax rates that would be applied to an airfare. So the airlines are even benefiting from that, plus the nice coincidence that fuel prices are much lower.
And now there's this push, at least here in Washington, by the airline lobby to not have to be transparent about those fees. When you do an online booking, for example, you see what you're paying. There's a push now to not have to report on that and not have to reveal that.
Well, everybody has a different definition of transparency. Getting that piece of the pie out to figure out what you're paying for what is becoming harder and harder. You're either going to get bundled or unbundled, but either way, you're going to be paying more. I mean, at the end of the day, what are you opting out for? Are you opting out of a meal? Okay, no problem. Are you opting out of a blanket? Who would ever want to touch those blankets? Are you right? I mean, so the real bottom line is we need to get back to a basic definition of why we fly. And in my book, there's only one definition. We fly to go from point A to point B and not die. And we're not there for the wine list. We're not there for the rich Corinthian leather. We're not there for the Broadway show tunes the flight attendants will not be performing on board. We're only there to get from A to B. The problem, though, is so is everybody else. And with less capacity, it's inevitable you'll be paying more for your ticket.
So those are all consequences to the consumer, but I can imagine that investors and shareholders are going to be pretty happy with the news coming out of these airline reports this week and next.
Oh, they're going to be thrilled. And it's a trend that will continue as long as fuel prices stay down. But even if fuel prices go up, the airlines have figured out their capacity issues. And remember, it's sort of like an oligopoly right now. You know, how many airline flights do they have, does American Airlines have to Atlanta? Not that many. How many airline flights does Delta have to Dallas? Not that many. They're actually respecting each other's territory. They're not competing in those areas, especially in this country. Overseas, that's where the battleground is, because that's where your high-yield customers are, those BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and don't forget Korea. That's where the money is, and that's where those airlines want to play.
What are the consequences of these airlines going to try to create more routes internationally?
Well, the consequence is this. There's not an airline that I know of right now that is sufficiently poised either in terms of capital or in terms of emotion to fill that lost capacity in this country. So if you really want to figure out what's the fastest growing form of transportation in this country, it's the bus. 3,200 routes of trips of less than 400 miles. And that's where people are doing it. And as long as fuel prices are down, more and more people are actually driving to the airport where they can find a flight. And those trips could be 200 miles. So that's what's happening. You're not going to see in the next 2 or 3 years a lot of new entrant carriers in this country to fill that lost capacity in cities like I mentioned. It's just not going to happen.
So you're telling us American passengers, we're not going to have better prices, we're not going to have more route choices. Is there any upside for the passenger that flies in and out of the United States?
Yeah, you're going to have better buses.